Oliver Hale had a reputation as one of the most affluent, untouchable figures in the city, known for his immense wealth, sprawling estates, and high-powered business connections. Oliver believed he understood the world's problems better than most. However, his understanding of life's challenges was theoretical at best, limited to charity galas and high-profile fundraisers, where he contributed vast sums to causes he'd never personally witnessed. One winter evening, Oliver Saturday in his luxurious library, sifting through charity proposals, he paused, staring at a report detailing the homelessness crisis. He had always been sympathetic but never felt personally connected. These numbers are just statistics, he thought. How can they mean anything to me when I've never truly seen their faces? In that moment, a daring idea struck him. He would go undercover, spending a week on the streets, living as those he'd only read about. He was driven less by pure altruism and more by curiosity, a test of how society treated its most vulnerable. He wanted to know, if he could understand the world that was so far removed from his own. 2 days later, Oliver stepped out onto the cold city streets, disguised as an ordinary homeless man named Eli. Gone were his designer suits, polished shoes, and carefully groomed hair. Instead, he wore worn-out layers and carried nothing but a ragged blanket and an empty coffee cup. He chose a spot across from his own mansion, the irony of the location giving him a strange thrill. He wanted to see how people, friends, and strangers alike, would respond to his vulnerable, unfamiliar form. The first day was an awakening. People passed him without a glance, their eyes skimming over him as if he were part of the sidewalk. Every time someone ignored him, a pang of discomfort stirred in his heart. He'd never known such invisibility. The proud, confident Oliver Hale man, who commanded respect with a single look, was now a shadow in the corner of their gaze. Hours passed, and hunger gnawed at him. A wealthy acquaintance strolled by, holding a shopping bag from an expensive boutique, but she never once looked his way. It was as though he didn't exist. He extended his cup toward her, and she recoiled, quickening her pace. The reality of life on the streets was harsher than he'd imagined, and each rejection left him feeling more vulnerable and isolated. Over the next few days, Oliver's carefully constructed worldview began to unravel. He witnessed scenes he'd only read about: the struggles for warmth, the fight for scarce food, and the constant feeling of being overlooked. People who had once nodded at him in passing, business partners and socialites, now walked past without recognition or care. The divide between him and the people he thought he knew seemed to grow wider with each encounter. But he also saw unexpected kindness from those who had little to give. A man named Ben, who'd been homeless for over a decade, shared half of his sandwich with him on the third day. "Up here, we look after each other," Ben said with a wry smile. "It's not much, but it keeps you going." The act moved Oliver deeply. He had been the one used to providing for others. Yet here he was, receiving charity from someone who had almost nothing. Each day, his heart softened further, and he found himself torn between his former life and this raw, honest reality. The simplicity of this existence was brutal, but it was also genuine, unfiltered by social expectations and pretense. On the 5th day, a terrible storm hit the city. Rain poured from the skies, and a biting wind swept through the streets. Oliver huddled under an awning, drenched and shivering. His blanket was soaked, his makeshift shelter nearly useless. For the first time, he felt genuine fear. Fear of exposure, of being cold and hungry without an escape. It was no longer an experiment. The boundary between his two lives was disappearing, and with it, the sense of control he'd held. As he Saturday, defeated and soaked, an older woman approached. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of pity and concern. "You look like you need a warm drink," she said, handing him a small thermos of tea. "This city can be a harsh place." Oliver was taken aback. He had grown used to being ignored. Yet here was a stranger offering him compassion without expecting anything in return. He thanked her, his voice catching in his throat. That simple act of kindness felt warmer than any blanket, more comforting than any luxury he'd ever known. On the 7th day, just as he prepared to end his journey, an incident occurred that shattered him. A wealthy man, whom Oliver knew well from his social circle, walked past with his teenage son. The son sneered, pointing at Oliver and laughing, saying, "See, Dad, That's what happens when people don't work hard. The father gave a half-hearted chuckle, murmuring, "Not everyone can be saved, son." Oliver's heart broke, knowing that this was the perception of his own friends, people who lived only a stone's throw from his own mansion. He wanted to shout, to reveal himself, to make them understand that luck, privilege, and opportunity could not be measured solely by a work ethic. But he stayed silent, realizing that to truly understand, they would have to walk in these shoes themselves. That night, as he returned home and washed away the grime of the past week, Oliver felt like a different man. The walls of his mansion seemed colder, emptier. His material possessions now felt hollow, mere trinkets in comparison to the depth of humanity he had encountered. He couldn't ignore what he had learned. The life he once led now seemed superficial, disconnected from reality. In the weeks that followed, Oliver made sweeping changes. He started an outreach program, not just donating money but offering resources, vocational training, and shelter to those in need. He partnered with community leaders, people who had experienced homelessness, and gave them positions of authority in his organization, trusting their lived expertise over his theoretical knowledge. The crowning moment came a year later at a fundraiser, where he was awarded for his contributions. As he accepted the award, he spoke openly about his journey, revealing his week on the streets. The room fell silent as he shared the harsh realities he'd experienced, the shame he felt for his past ignorance, and the powerful lesson he had learned about empathy and privilege. True wealth, he concluded, is not measured by the money we hoard but by the compassion we share. I've seen humanity at its lowest, and I know now that it's my duty and yours to lift those who have been overlooked. His speech left the audience teary-eyed, and he was met with a standing ovation. Oliver's story became a beacon of hope, a call for empathy that inspired change throughout the city. He had entered the streets as a man of wealth but returned with something far more precious, a heart attuned to the struggles of others, and a soul forever changed by the price of empathy. And as he left the stage, he saw the faces of people he now considered friends, people who had once lived invisible lives in the shadows, now standing with pride and purpose, embraced by a society they had long felt forgotten by. Oliver knew that he could never repay them for the lessons they had taught him, but he would spend the rest of his life trying.